Jason stood frozen outside the boardroom as muffled shouting echoed from within. Dalron had just discovered their competitor's new product, built from Jason's own 5-year roadmap. The same one his boss stole, then fired him over. Panic spread like wildfire behind those glass walls. But what happened next will shock even those who thought they'd seen everything. But first, let's go back to the beginning. Jason Whitman's office was a small, windowless square tucked behind the break room. No view, no ventilation, just the soft whir of the overhead fluorescence and the faint hum of the soda machine through the drywall. It hadn't always been that way. In his second year at Dalron Analytics, he was promised a relocation to the corner office as soon as space freed up. That promise, like so many others, evaporated into the thick fog of corporate amnesia. But Jason wasn't naive, not anymore. He had come to understand the unspoken architecture of places like Dalron. The golden boys with golf club handshakes rose fast. The thinkers, the grinders, the ones like him who quietly kept everything from collapsing, stayed nailed to the floor. The strategy decks he crafted, the data models that sliced through noise like razors, the long nights mapping out client retention plans. None of that had ever been enough. Not when someone like Lori Kinsey was standing above it all, a master at repackaging his work with a brighter smile and a more expensive suit. It was subtle at first. A line missing from a shared document. A slide credited to executive team instead of to him. But over time, the pattern crystallized. She wasn't just ignoring his contributions, she was absorbing them. The final straw had been last quarter's board review. Jason had spent 40 hours outside work preparing that analysis. He even built a predictive model on churn that had stunned their data team. When the presentation was delivered, Lori's voice filled the room, and Jason watched from the shadows as she read his words off the screen like they were hers. No footnote, no glance in his direction, just the firm applause of directors who assumed they were witnessing her genius. He hadn't spoken about it to anyone, not even Michelle, his wife, who often asked why he looked so hollow when he came home. He just smiled and said, "It's a busy season." But inside, Jason had begun to keep score. And still, he didn't plan to leave, not initially. There was always the hope that one day someone would see, that his loyalty would carry weight. But hope, he realized, was the most sophisticated form of denial. So when Lori said, with that saccharine detachment, that HR would walk him through his options, Jason simply nodded. Not because he was defeated, but because the decision had already been made. Not by Lori, by him. 3 days before Lori summoned him into her office, Jason sat in a minimalist glass-walled conference room 34 floors above downtown, opposite a man named Marcus Gray, the COO of Zemera. No slides, no formal presentation, just coffee, black, and a contract folder the thickness of a novella. Marcus had leaned forward, resting his forearms on the polished oak table, and asked one question. "If you were us, how would you gut Dalron from the inside out?" Jason didn't blink. He didn't gloat. He spoke like a surgeon explaining a procedure he'd performed 100 times. He outlined the inefficiencies, the obsolete procurement pipeline Lori insisted was cost-optimized, the legacy database still using partial encryption, the quarterly market analyses outsourced to a firm 2 years behind the curve. He described the Achilles heel of Dalron's SaaS model, how the client onboarding process was so bloated it cost them more than it retained. He mapped the precise moment when Dalron shifted from innovation to stagnation, and how the rot had metastasized from Lori's decisions downward. What Jason knew wasn't stolen, it was lived. Years of notes, internal decks, buried Slack threads, and war room meetings that Lori barely understood but claimed to lead. And then he laid down the trump card, Dalron's 5-year strategic roadmap, authored by him, version-controlled in an internal system Lori had never logged into. The offer that followed was not generous, it was surgical. Zemera didn't need a soldier. They needed a scalpel. And Jason, calm and unshaken, accepted without ceremony. No counter, no theatrics. Just a handshake, a signature, and the quiet transfer of power. What Lori had never considered, never imagined, was that Jason had become the very thing she dismissed. Irreplaceable. And in her haste to remove a perceived threat, she had triggered a transfer of institutional knowledge so vast and so quietly explosive it would take weeks before Dalrun even realized what they had lost. Jason didn't walk out of Dalrun unemployed. He walked out fully armed, not with vengeance, but with insight. And in the corridors of Zemera, beneath the buzz of innovation and expansion, Jason moved like a ghost through a house he used to live in, opening the same doors, but this time on the other side. The unraveling of Lori Kinsey's empire began not with a bang, but with a whisper. A rumor murmured between cubicles, tight-lipped glances in the hallways, and the soundless dread that settles over a sinking ship before the alarms go off. The first breach came via Slack. A mid-level analyst pinged a colleague with a question about a feature set in Zemera's new platform that looked too familiar. The file comparison was damning. Zemera hadn't just beat Dalrun to market, they had beat them with their own playbook. The feature design, rollout timeline, and even internal code names matched elements from Dalrun's unpublished 5-year roadmap. The only conclusion possible was one no executive dared say aloud. This is ours. Within hours, the boardroom lights burned bright past midnight. Emergency meetings swirled with vague phrases. Data leakage, strategic compromise, possible IP exposure. Lori sat at the head of the table, not quite pale, not quite flushed, but distinctly unsettled in a way that betrayed the slipping leash of control. She deflected, redirected. "We had no reason to believe Jason would act with malice," she said flatly. "If anything, this is a wake-up call for tightening our NDAs." But then came the file. A zip folder emailed anonymously to multiple directors, marked only, "Read this before you call legal." Inside was Jason's exit interview, unread, unopened, buried in HR's records like a forgotten invoice. The document was methodical, clinical, a ledger of institutional rot. He detailed the decisions he had made, the ones Lori had overridden, and the ones she had plagiarized, word for word, from decks he'd authored alone at 3 a.m. There were screenshots of edits where she removed his name, Slack timestamps showing her reshaping his ideas minutes before meetings, and calendar invites she'd never forwarded, effectively cutting him from his own strategy sessions. And then came the firestorm. Fast and Fearless, a high-traffic tech publication with a taste for blood, received a tip from someone inside HR, anonymous, deliberate, and armed. The headline splashed across LinkedIn by morning. "Top strategist fired for job hunting, exposes CEO's decade of exploitation." The article hit like a sledgehammer. Former employees emerged from the woodwork, adding fuel. Quotes, receipts, Slack captures, and a resurfaced video from a 2018 retreat where Lori quipped, "Jason's like duct tape, always there, not pretty, but gets the job done." It wasn't just unprofessional, it was cruel. The board didn't hesitate. By Friday, the company issued a brief, sterile statement. Effective immediately, Lori Kinsey is no longer with Dalrun Analytics. Inside the building, no one cheered, but the silence that followed, it felt like justice. The ballroom was cathedral hushed as Jason Whitman took the stage. No lasers, no intro video, no swelling orchestral music. Just him in a charcoal gray suit, tailored but not flashy, and the screen behind him, black for a heartbeat, before it flickered to life with a single line of white text. "We're not in a position to adjust compensation right now. Let's revisit in Q2. Lori Kinsey, former CEO of Dalrun Analytics. Laughter broke like thunder. It wasn't just amusement, it was recognition. The kind of laughter that comes when hundreds of professionals see their own ignored emails, their own gaslit ambitions, their own brushed-off excellence finally held up to the light. Laughter laced with catharsis. Jason didn't bask in it. He let it hang for a moment, nodded once, and said simply, "Let's talk about what happens when organizations forget who builds the foundation." His voice was calm, even, measured. No jabs, no theatrics, just scalpel-sharp insight wrapped in that trademark poise. He didn't name names. He didn't need to. Instead, he traced the anatomy of talent waste, how companies sink millions into recruiting and branding, only to ignore the very people who carry the weight in silence. He detailed the quiet exits, the intellectual theft, the managers who confuse control with leadership. He spoke of how vision gets sterilized in bureaucracies, and how culture, once rotten, doesn't rot from the top down, but from the invisible middle out. The audience didn't shift in their seats. They leaned forward. He ended not with triumph, but with clarity. The companies that win the next decade won't be the ones with the loudest slogans. They'll be the ones where no one has to ask for recognition, because they're already seen. Applause? Yes. But something deeper pulsed beneath it. Reverence. When Jason stepped backstage, he didn't check social media. He didn't look for praise. He reached for his phone to silence it, and noticed the email. The subject line was sterile, flat. Licensing request. Sent from the new CEO of Dalron. He didn't flinch, didn't click. He just opened the Zamara legal group chat and dropped it in with a single message. "You know what to do." Then he slipped the phone into his pocket and exhaled. Not triumph. Closure.